All right, another week, another podcast. I'm T Dub. This is just Justin here.
Hey y'all.
Rush Hour Pod. I thought we'd change it up this week, just with give people some sort of you know, I don't want to say tips, but how we got started in the industry. We've been in it for between us over 30 some years. I thought we could talk about a little bit of a setup. I think I'll set it up in terms of like, hey, how do you think about growth? How do you think about where to start if I'm trying to join a company or grow a company or start a company? And then I thought I'd kick it to you to give us like real live examples of sort of what you've done that you think might be helpful for our audience in terms of what's helped you grow, what's translatable to sort of any business. And then we can talk, industry stuff. But I thought let's start with things that where we can help people out. How about that?
No, this sounds great. I've actually gotten really excited about today. So
Um,
let's get
so
into
I-
it.
I'll kick it off. Actually, created some really generic slides. They're pretty rudimentary, but I figured we'd start there. At least give people a quick snapshot. Let me kick it to slideshow view. And so, where do I get started? Here's when I start join a company or I'm starting a company. Here's kind of a framework for how I think about it. I start with active user base. This could be um, all you have, or this could be a small percentage of what you have, depending on where you're joining the company and what size they are. But here's kind of a sort of campaign look at if you're active, where do you start? Right? You think about a welcome series. How you welcome them, whether it's in app or through notifications or emails or social or whatever it may be. A welcome series, and you got to think about what's the value prop, what makes you different, what can I give as an incentive to people. Generally, how I look at it is like incentives always help. You don't want to rely on them, but if you have currency or some sort of bonus or some sort of badge system, whatever it is, think about what you can give them out of the gate that maybe will get some loyalty. And then me and you've always done this social welcome. Like, how can I get sort of the community to show love to people who are recently joining, whether it's dating or gaming or Twitch or whatever it is. Like when you're first joining a place, it can be kind of intimidating. So like having other people make sure to sort of show some flowers in terms of like, hey, appreciate you joining. Welcome to the team. It helps. We've seen it help across every industry. The next one, the big one, buyer conversion, right? If you've now joined, you started, you've got a decent sort of retention. The person is active. How do I convert them to buy? And generally, that is relevancy, right? What's their propensity to buy? Same deal. How do I send them promos? How do I get them in front of things to make a purchase? Which seems very obvious, but that's kind of where you need to concentrate if revenue is your goal. The next one is part of that loyalty series, right? Things like it's so simple, right? Like sending a thank you email. You'd be amazed at how many companies have joined. They're like, oh yeah, we don't do that. We don't thank people for making their first purchase or a second purchase, or we don't. We just send a receipt. Um, and then the next one is a first to test features. So, kind of like a preview, like, hey, you're part of our family. We want you to try out this new feature. Tell us what you think. That's sort of the feedback loop. People feel like they have a little more invested in the company when you ping them and ask them that. And that could come from you. It could come from a marketing email. It could come from social, Twitter, DMs. There's a number of ways you could do that. But I think people generally appreciate that and become more loyal. And then I call this next bucket pro activation, which is if you're starting from a new user here on the top, getting towards the bottom is people that are sort of fading. You haven't seen them for a couple days. Every company is a little different with what they consider lapsed. Maybe it's 7 days, maybe it's 30 days, maybe it's a year. But like people that are sort of showing signs of inactivity, then it's like, all right, what can I do? How do I get them back? Is there some sort of social recommendation I can use? Like, hey, friends are here. Here's what they're doing. What are some other incentives I can do to bring them back? Things like that we found very helpful. And then in most companies, you've got this large user base of inactive, right? People that tried it, that have bailed, that have left for whatever variety of reasons, and that that you can go crazy in this world of inactive users, like how to win them back, which is generally what people do, right? Well, this is like the easiest way. It's incremental lift. How do you bring them back? What are the actions? You probably want to dig into the data, figure out what they are, remind them of the value prop. Again, bring them back with some sort of incentive. Do everything you can to sort of win them back, and then on the tail end of that, if they're just not coming back, the other thing you could do is, hey, new features, new products. Here's some other things that we think that might be of interest to you based on sort of what we know. And like this is for me, and I think you can jump into this as well. This is sort of a good framework to understand. All right, where's my biggest opportunity? How do I prioritize what's what? By filling in the numbers, right? Like how many are new? How many are active? How many are recently inactive? How many are totally inactive? How many have been lapsed for however many days? And you just kind of can do the math in terms of like, where should I focus my energy? If you know you're going to put a lot of money into new, you probably want to focus on this welcome and buyer conversion. Or if you're like, hey, I got a bunch of people lapsed, here's what I'm going to do for these lapsed users. Are I have no problem getting people into my app, they just won't stay. What should I do? This is an incredible way for you to figure out, at least for me, where to get started. Like, what do I do? Like, there's um, the saying is, you can do anything, but you can't do everything. So you've
Yep.
kind of got to pick and choose your battles. And this is when I start. This is one great way for me to sort of like use the data and fill all these pieces in to see what could potentially make the biggest impact, and then sort of go from there. But
Yeah. No, I love this as a framework. Not only is it really simple, kind of easy to follow if you're a novice or even someone more experienced, but there are kind of three things that I pulled out of it that struck me as you were going through this. The first is kind of like thinking about it holistically in terms of like taking a step back. How do I be thoughtful about each of these areas? How do I get the data that I need to kind of make an assessment of where they are? But also thinking about funnels. And I talk about
right,
this a lot when I join companies. Is like everything is within some type of conversion funnel. You're moving people either down the funnel or up the funnel or whatever it is, and you have drop offs and you have certain conversion rates. And ideally, you're trying to find where those points are that you think you can have like more of an impact on. You're trying to increase conversions there, get more people to the next step of the funnel. So that piece kind of really stood out. The second was around um, not explicitly said here, but implicitly the importance of working with product team. I
yes,
don't think that like as a marketing team, a lot of marketing teams work in isolation of the product team, but I found that those who perform the best are working in tandem, not only to understand this data and have the historical background, particularly if you're coming in as a marketer and trying to,
all right,
improve different parts of this. Product leads are probably going to have a good sense, but also within the context of just knowing what's coming down the pipeline. A lot of stuff that you pointed out here, new feature, roadmap, et cetera. You need to understand what's coming down the pipeline. And you're not going to understand that unless you're really close with your product team. And then the other thing that I think is really interesting in terms of how do you start and how do you think about this holistically was you talk about, a lot of these things that you're doing are to drive retention and to bring people
right,
back, and not necessarily just acquisition, although some of this stuff I guess can acquire users is more about users who are already in the journey. But I always say, and I think you would agree, that the biggest driver of growth is retention. You could
absolutely,
have the best campaigns ever, but if you have a bucket of water and you throw it into a net, all the water is going to fall through the net. And that's how people should think about kind of
right.
marketing activities in as it relates to the product as well. So those kind of the three things that I was able to pull here that I thought were really helpful.
Yeah, where this really helps me when I'm at a company is when you do get the numbers, you generally understand, hey, how many people are naturally coming in new, how many people are becoming inactive with your retention numbers, and you can make goals, and you can hit your KPIs. You can overlay those quickly, and when you hear somebody say, hey, I want to double my user base, and it's like, hey, I want to double my active user base right now. You're going to pull out these numbers, and you're going to be like, well, if we're going to do that, then I've got to hit X, Y, and Z on some of
Mm.
these conversions, right? Because let's be realistic. Inactive, you're not going to convert 100%. It's impossible. So that may look like, oh, I have 100 million inactive people, so I've got a opportunity to hit 100 million people and bring them all back. That's not the case, right? So
Yeah.
you've got to be realistic and say, hey, look, inactive, I probably can only use email and social, and that has an impression and conversion rate that's very low. So out of the 100 million, maybe I can get 100,000 of those people back,
Right.
right? Like if I
Right.
do a great job, I'm only getting 100,000. So I think a lot of times, at the top, you just see the overall broad numbers, and you're like, hey, I'm going to double my, active user base this quarter, and here's how I'm going to do it. You better, like, for anybody that's in sort of a PM or in marketing, head of marketing role, you better know these numbers and understand the general benchmark conversion of each of these, so that you can say, sort of call BS on a number where you're like, hey, we're gonna double our user base, but we're not gonna spend any money on UA, and we're not gonna do anything on, like, you can just call BS and be like, that's impossible, unless you drop a bunch of incredibly viral features. And like you said, that's having this sort of framework in your back pocket where you understand the conversion of each of these really helps you in a lot of these prioritization meetings. It helps you in sort of like the OKR meetings, where it's like, hey, what can we reasonably do this quarter, next quarter, this year, next year? What do we have to do to move these numbers? And this will tell you a nice sort of clear picture on what can you expect.
Yeah. If I were on the other side of this, I would definitely be screenshotting this image that you put together as a framework, which is really helpful. And I think there's something about, obviously, we have a lot of scars on both of our ends
Yes.
and things we've tried and not, but I think a lot of things can be kind of boiled down to a relatively simple approach that's repeatable and scalable. And I also think that there's something about trying to put yourself in the user's shoes, try to like understand the
Yep.
intuition to the like your intuition around kind of human interactions of your own, right? If you send somebody a thank you note after they've done something nice for you, you feel better. You probably have
Right.
like greater, you probably hold those people in higher esteem. And the same thing can happen if done in an authentic way and done with, kind of data at what the right touch points are through email marketing or in-app and everything else you kind of discussed. So, that's yeah, just like the simplicity of what you put together and how some of these things can just apply to like how you think about your regular that human element into the product experience.
Yeah, obviously it's a very loose framework. Every company is going to have varying shapes and sizes, but like, when I'm starting off, I try to like look at those numbers and understand, hey, here's my real opportunity here. Example, when we joined Twitch, or when we joined Tagged, it was like, hey, here's the size of each of these, and it really keeps you real, right? Like, you can't just make up users out of thin air unless you're going to spend some money or drive some new features. So if that's what your executive team is expecting, you can at least show the numbers and be like, hey, realistically, this is what we've
Yeah.
got. This is what you're trying to drum up. You're saying we're going to grow this from this. Here's what I'm going to have to do, and here's the
Yeah.
support I'm going to need, and that's like, it's kind of eye opening when you
No,
look
for
at it
sure.
that way.
It's really interesting, and this will maybe segue into my section where I talk about some specific tactics that we use in terms of growth. But let's go back into the Wayback Machine.
Yep.
Historically, me and T Dub first met when a company I was working on, our team was acquired by a company where he was working called Tag. Well, actually, the company by the time I joined was called If We, which was then like a holding company that had acquired a few other businesses. Tag was one that was made in house, but they acquired a company called High Five. You can think of these as kind of OG social platforms that were
Yep.
major desktop competitors of the Friendsters and Facebook and MySpace at the time. Those companies, or at least Facebook, made the best transition to mobile and kind of won out. But you had If We, that was still doing really well, profitable company, and was trying to find out some ways to grow. And one of my first interviews, like before they decided to bring our team in, was with TW. He was my first manager, and so that's kind of how we first met. But I want to see if you co-sign this. But I remember one thing that was striking during the interview was you were like, "Hey man, you have a lot of like good ideas here, but I'm not sure any of this stuff will actually work here, which was like a fair enough, which was fair enough of what he said. And there are two things in particular, in terms of like performance marketing and trying to figure out new ways to put creative together, and then push notifications. And we had some fits and starts, but and some of that stuff were better than others. But there's the whole point around like having data, testing and learning, having a hypothesis, trying it out. It's all stuff we had to kind of do together and also show and prove there. I don't know if you kind of remember
Yeah.
some of those conversations about that
No,
stuff.
for sure. I tend to like probably skew on the keeping it too real in those interviews because I feel like that's what you should hear, right? Like,
100%.
um, and instead of like fluffing things up, I tend to like make things sound worse than what they generally are, and then you come in and kind of prepared for a much worse scenario than what's really there.
No, 100%, 100%.
But yeah, I think that was really the gist of it. It was like, hey, you got to come in here and test. Like, I remember that behind the scenes saying, no, Justin and Brian are exactly what we need. But there was a scary feeling of like we don't know how any of this stuff is going to work like realistically, and like we did look at those exact numbers. Say if we were implemented some of these things, here's generally where we would be. Is that enough? And obviously the answer was yes. So yeah, like I think it was a really fun time for us to bring on like new energy and new thoughts. Like me and you tend to agree a lot on like, hey, ideas are kind of a dime a dozen. It's like the execution of it that really
100%.
showcases. And I think that's where we really flourish in our team. It was really like any idea is good. It's just like, what can we do? How do we do it?
Mm-hmm.
And how can we do it, implement it, and show? I mean, I remember those, we were doing reviews every week of things we were launching. And we were like the only team that was like every week we had
Consistently knocking
results.
stuff out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Whether it was good or bad, but it was like we were putting in work, which I appreciated. And, obviously Tagged wasn't the cool, slickest UI and greatest company we've ever worked at, but I do remember that very vividly. Like the impact that we were able to make every week was like palpable. It was really fun. Like that part.
Yeah.
Would you agree?
Yeah.
Like,
Oh, 100%. Yeah. The reason why I kind of is because it's really my kind of first real experience. I mean, I worked, doing a startup, but like the first real experience working at a Silicon Valley tech company
right.
that had been successful in kind of understanding how those companies are run and the personality types and the expectations,
Yes.
et cetera. And I credit you a lot towards, having a tremendous introduction to that space and what can be, kind of harrowing, in
Yeah,
terms of
for
like the
sure.
realness that comes in. So, it was a tremendous experience and we got a lot done. And then we, worked together many times after that.
Yeah, for
So
sure.
that has been, was awesome. So, just to kind of transition over to my piece, what I thought I would do was to talk through some examples of different growth tactics by kind of discipline and focus it on my time as an entrepreneur. So kind of going from 0 to 1 company that was acquired by Tag, where TW and I met, and I thought I'd break it into influencer marketing, campus ambassador programs, and press. There will probably be more topics we could talk about down the line, but relative to my experience at my startup, I thought this would be kind of the most interesting, and I could, be as transparent as possible with all the tax
Yeah.
because it was my company.
Yeah, I love
So
it.
yeah, so just to reorient again, Bay stood for before anyone else. It was a mobile dating app for Black singles that I co-founded with my brother Brian and another co-founder Jordan. We saw an opening in the market for apps to target Black folks. There was Black People Meet. There was a few other platforms that were out there, but nothing that was mass adopted. So we tried to go after that. And so we didn't have, at first we didn't have any money, and we had to think of a lot of and to drive, some momentum with the limited money, which is basically our savings. And so, one of the first things that we did before we were able to raise some angel funding was kind of think about influencer marketing as a channel. And at the time, this is around 2014 when influencer marketing was a practice, but it wasn't as prominent as it is now. Everyone kind of
Right.
knows influencer marketing now and kind of the efficacy. Before it was like, wait, you pay people to post on like their account and then it somehow works. It was just thought of as kind of like not a real marketing practice. And maybe even some people still feel like that. But I think things have really changed, with creator economy and what's happened in the past. So in any event, with influencer marketing, what you're trying to do is find people who are aligned with your brand, pay them to post on your behalf. This could be individuals, blogs, YouTube account, meme pages, etc. And so there were two different approaches that we use for influencer marketing to try to figure out what worked well. And actually, I'll give one example from Bay, and then I'll give another example for another startup that I worked at. Marketing was taking a targeted approach. Very attractive black male fitness creators. We got them to make a profile on our app. Then we would post those their pictures on a popular blog. It's called The Shade Room. That has like 29 million users now, and say, hey, these people are on the app. Some kind of like funny comment or title around the content. And what we're able to do is trend several times in the App Store with this content. So we would post it. We would get a tremendous amount of installs. I think like one time we got like 10,000 installs, and we're trending, in the App Store off this approach. And this essentially was finding a targeted audience that we knew would resonate with our product, finding content that we think would be interesting, and then distributing it on a place where a lot of those people congregated. So that was kind of like a targeted influencer approach that we used that worked really well. What I used at another startup was more of a broad-based approach, also targeting influencers, but not necessarily knowing who the target group would be. And this was at a company called Backyard, which essentially was integrating games into a kind of Zoom, Google Hangouts type of format. So imagine in this conversation we're having now, with the click of a button, you could play Words with Friends or chess or checkers, etc. And this was during the pandemic, so a lot of people were at home looking for things to do. We thought that this would be a model that was interesting. And so the reason why I call this a broad approach was we didn't necessarily know what our target user persona was before. With Bay, we assumed black women, put attractive black men, that would hit. And our intuition was right on that. And we were of the demographic, so we knew it pretty well. For the other one, we were trying to figure out what that was. So what we did was we went out to an influencer marketplace, and we put together a creative brief to a wide swath of creators. With some general hypothesis around, hey, we thought these people would be Gen Z. We thought we would target women, and kind of day in the life type of creators in terms of people that we thought would resonate with the content. So we had 20 creators make content. And because at the time, this is 2020 period, there was like an arbitrage opportunity in influencers. We were able to pay relatively low cost, between $200 and $500 for each of these folks. The company raised some money, so we had a little more money to play with. But one of these posts was a breakout success. It went viral, generated 6 million views, 35,000 comments on the post, wow, 200,000 shares. It was the impetus for like this viral moment that the company had, where they ended up acquiring several million users. And then we just had to I was only spending $8,000 a month on influencer marketing. That was the only channel we ever used to grow. And it just kind of went on from there. So key takeaways for those two approaches is that, one, a targeted approach can work really well if you already know who user persona is and like where that demographic congregates. Broad approaches are good to understand what type of content can work well, and ideally to narrow down in a demographic that's the most receptive. It doesn't necessarily mean things will go viral all the time, but you're gonna get a better sense of the content that works and try to like narrow in on a group. And that's how we use influencer marketing. And I'll go into campus ambassador stuff next, but any comments or feedback that you had on that, TW, in your experience?
No, that was great. I do remember that. And that was, you were early on the game. I always think about that because you and Brian were so ahead of the game. And some of the influencers you worked with at Bay turned out to be massive multi-million-dollar entities. But that framework is what I also use. I started Locker Room Access, and it naturally was with some NBA players, so we had some built-in influence. But it was similar, right? It was like, we're going to make some posts, we're going to see what works, we're going to double down on what doesn't. And it was kind of similar. Like, we had a moment where we had some gear, we got it on ESPN, and thing blew up, right? Like you get all these you sellouts of merchandise, and you get all active in the community. And it's like, I was going to ask you, when you guys were, and maybe this is more of a Bay one, but when you saw something work, what was that feeling? What was the feeling of excitement, or was it more? Was it cautious excitement, or was it like pure joy?
It was pure joy, man. I mean, you got to understand, and you can empathize with this, right? When you're starting something from scratch, and particularly, I had worked at Microsoft before, but I hadn't worked on mobile apps, and we were building everything from scratch. You put all of your time and effort. I was in business school at the time, right before we kind of raised this funding, and literally all my waking hours were put into this business. I didn't have a very traditional experience, so startup life is a roller coaster ride. When you get those highs, man, I
Yeah,
mean, there's nothing better than that
yeah,
feeling, especially when you have like a hypothesis around an idea or strategy and you execute it and it works
yeah.
even better than you would have thought, right? There's
And
nothing like
then
that.
and then how did that differ from when you were doing it for someone else? Like, obviously it's not you're part of the team, but it's not your company anymore.
Yeah.
Was it a tempered sort of excitement, or because it's kind of like on to the next thing, right? It's a little bit of
Yeah,
that.
I don't think anything's gonna match the same level of excitement as working
Yeah,
on your own company or startup. That being said, when you're early enough and you're in the trenches with people and you experience this kind of outside success, it's still mad exciting and fun. And
yeah,
again, it's also more data points to inform future strategies of like getting your hit rate higher. Because I
yeah,
think that I feel like particularly with growth or when you're trying to experiment and figure out the models of work, it's all about experimentation. But ideally, you're trying to, you know, figure out what you need to grow in as few experiments as possible, right? You
yes,
save on costs
exactly.
and you're able to get your momentum going, et cetera. So you're sharpening your sword. You know, you're increasing your percentage hit rate, right?
Yes,
If you're a 3-point shooter, you're trying to get like, I mean, no one's going to get 50%, but if you get in the high 40s, you're good. So if you can get from 42 to 43%, in terms of numbers change, the number doesn't change that much, but like that's a percentage. That's a great percentage change, right? And
right.
so I think that's what you're trying to do with like all the things that you test.
Yeah, yeah. Often think about it like a control panel of like dot, like you're when you're starting, you don't know what dials do what, so you're kind of like, I'm going to turn this one up and nothing happened, and I'm going, and then it's sort of like when one works, you kind of get to label that dial, right, to say, all right, this did this, I'm going to put this here, and
Yep.
like I'm going to spend some more and try to turn it up to see what happens. And it's, yeah, it is fun, and for me, it's sort of like I always try to temper the enthusiasm. So I'm like, all right, that worked now, but we don't. Who knows
Yeah.
if it's gonna work again? So let's
Yeah, that's
not
true.
get too
At the same
crazy.
time, when you get those big wins, you gotta
No, it's
celebrate a
awesome.
little bit because
Yeah, it's
they're
awesome.
hard earned. Cool. So maybe I'll go into the next one, which is around campus ambassador programs. So again, using Bay as an example, we didn't have money at this point. We had a little bit of money, but not a lot. We created a campus ambassador program at Howard. This is before we launched our app to the world, with the thought that if we launched at Howard, which was kind of a symbol of Black excellence, but also kind of like a Black cultural hub
Yep.
within like HBCU communities, and we thought that could be a broader rollout strategy. We wanted to figure out how we can get access to people who really knew what was going on campus, and they can help us activate in the right way. And so ultimately, we got about 5 or 6 ambassadors. Shout out to my sister who helped to drive a lot of that. She was at UVA at the time, but she had some friends who were at Howard, and she was able to make some of the connections there. But essentially, what we did was we organized these folks. We figured out what are the key events that are going on campus around the time that we wanted to launch, and how could we integrate in some type of activation in a way that felt authentic to the group. So what we ended up figuring out was that there was going to be this campus wide, which is essentially a bunch of vendors come on campus or a bunch of activities, games are played, et cetera. And there's a lot of hype around the community. So we ended up activating at SpringFest. We had a booth where we got to interact with students. And then we had the main launch of the app at the North versus South basketball game, which was a game that pitted students from the North on campus versus students from the South at their main gym. Everybody kind of shows that we had on the basketball court where everyone was playing. We put it in the right place because one of our ambassadors was like, "Don't put your banner here because no one will ever see it. Make sure it's placed here," which shows again the importance of getting people who kind of know what's going
Yeah.
on campus.
Feet on the ground.
And the activation was everybody who came in the stadium, if they had the app on their phone, they would get a ticket. We selected one of those tickets at halftime, and then the person who won got to shoot foul shots. And I think for every foul shot they made within a minute, they got $20. And it was like a cool interaction, and got our brand out there. The result of that was that we had content from the event go viral on Complex. It got about 10 million views. Shortly after that time, we began trending in the App Store, gave us credibility on the campus. That again was a cultural center for Black folks, and really kind of situated us in a good way. So some of the kind of key takeaways from that type of activation in terms of growth are, working with ambassadors give you insights into what's going to work well in their campus before you go there and how to activate in an authentic way. it can also become a playbook that we use not to the same level of success, but successfully at other campuses in terms of things that could repeat in terms of recruiting new folks and also quickly rolling out to a densely populated audience. And also, it was great online content that drove a lot of social proof and brand
Yeah.
legitimacy, that helped us to grow. So, yeah, that was our kind of campus ambassador experience. And I know you've done similar type of work with LRA and maybe other brands. So, not sure if you have any other examples, but would love to either get your feedback on this approach or hear an example from you.
Yeah, no, we today with NIL, you can actually incorporate some of that ambassador program plus student athlete. And with LRA, we did, we were the first ones at UVA to pay student athletes. It was like that program went live at midnight, the ability to pay. So we set it up with the entire basketball team. We got all of them on Instagram at midnight, sponsored by LRA, and they all had gear. We pre-sent them the gear packages, and then we got all of their info, worked with compliance, got it all set up, and that was really cool. And for us, it wasn't even necessarily about like, hey, I want to um, drive new business. It was like, hey, we want to support our student athletes and show that we care. There wasn't even a downstream KPI of them being influencers. It was more for us the look of supporting student athletes right away, being the first to do that because we care. And I think all of that stuff shows. We did a bunch of campaigns that were really focused around what students and alumni care about in the area. Um, and so I'll give you another example of a campaign. There was post COVID, during COVID, restaurants were really struggling. A lot of the restaurants in Charlottesville were really hurting. And one staple is the White Spot. You've probably been there
Mm-hmm.
in
Yep.
Charlottesville. And they have a hamburger with an egg on it. They were not, I wouldn't say struggling, but they were small. They were shut down. They couldn't do the thing very much.
They need the foot
They
traffic.
Yeah, they didn't have the foot traffic. People weren't going out. Everyone's working from home. Um, so we created a shirt. We had this similar box logo, but we made it just a white spot, just like their logo. It just kind of happened that way. And we sold those white spot shirts. Had a bunch of athletes wear them, and then we took all the money, the proceeds from that shirt. I think we sold 400 or 500 shirts. It was a decent amount of money. And we took that money, went into the White Spot, placed a massive order of burgers and food. We spent all the money there. And then we took that food and took it to the hospital and gave it to the workers that were going overtime during
Mm.
COVID. And that combination, same deal, got in the news, got a ton of support, and it was kind of just us thinking about how do we help everybody in the town in this time where everybody needs a little bit of love and support. And then it made everybody feel good. Like, right, student athletes are like, hey, I'm part of an organization that really cares for small businesses and cares for the people in the town. And like,
Mm-hmm.
we didn't, same deal. We didn't think about in terms of like, hey, this is going to be a great PR thing. We just did it because it was like, it felt like the right thing to do with that. And then, the results kind of showed because, people bought a ton of stuff, and they didn't just buy that shirt, as you can imagine. They'd go in and they'd buy tons of other things. They'd subscribe. We have subscription services. It's a great way to get a ton of like registration growth and interest in the company.
Yeah.
But having that, like you said, you need feet on the ground. You need to understand your community to really pull off something like that. So I think those perfect examples across the board of how do you
Yeah.
do it. You got to
Integrate authentically. And I'll just say, I don't know if you've told me that story before, but that's so amazing, man, that you did that. I know you've always been trying to serve that community, your Charlottesville community and kind of, folks on campus forever and are a huge fan, but that's awesome that you did that. I wasn't aware of that.
Yeah, it was kind of it's a nice touch. I mean, for everyone involved that, to do something to help,
Yeah,
so, all kinds of people, right? Like it just was we try to do that kind of stuff as much as possible where it's like,
totally.
take one thing and then expand it and help a bunch of different people. It's fun.
Amazing, man. Well, I know you had said that you didn't necessarily do it for press, but the last thing I was going to talk about was press and how you can leverage it
Yeah.
and the importance. And so, let's take a step back with, again, using Bay as an example. The team that founded the company, myself, my brother, and our other co-founder, Jordan, all, African-American folks, we knew that we had a compelling story and that it also could be a competitive differentiator for the brand. Not all brand stories are necessarily like that as they relate to the founders of the product. But I think when there is a certain synergy there and it can be used as a competitive differentiator, and we also didn't have a lot of money. We were trying to use kind of everything at our disposal. So, there are kind of three components to our, to the team that made for a unique storyline, and we tried to take advantage of that. So first, we were three black, co-founders, which is very unique within technology development, particularly back then, even still now, but there was a lot of fervor around, hey, we need to make, tech more diverse. We were trying to help our community, find dates and relationships. That's always, and that was something we were kind of trying to, we weren't trying to do from purely capitalistic perspective. We, really did want people to find meaningful connection on our platform. And also just like the time around dating apps, and like this is 2014, 2015. There was a lot of fervor on dating apps, and now everybody uses dating apps, but back then there was still a bit of more of a social faux pas in some ways that hadn't kind of driven, which it now has. So all those three elements made for a really compelling story. And so what we did to take advantage of that was we formed relationships with a lot of writers through Twitter, meeting them at events. So these could be people from Black press, think of, like the Source or Grio or, Blavity, Black Enterprise, all those sources. Find writers connection there. Reach out to Twitter. Try to meet them at events. Also, we try to, through any connection we could, try to find writers at like TechCrunch and VentureBeat, et cetera. Try to form meaningful relationships with and progress. We also created a listserv with all of our press contacts on there. So every time we had a bit of news, we would send it out. And
That's
what
awesome.
it resulted in was being featured in over 60 publications. We never spent $1 on PR. We registered as a top 50 lifestyle app in 20 African and Caribbean countries. So we were being written about overseas as well. And it also resulted in higher rates from our traffic coming from our website in terms of conversions, because we just create a lot of goodwill and there's a lot of positive press pieces. So, key takeaway there is that, with a compelling story, it's actually a good way to drive kind of free marketing for your business if you can kind of do it in an authentic way. And I think,
Right.
Similarly, if you think of other examples like Airbnb, they can credit a lot of their success to really understanding how to drive PR. So it can be a really effective way to drive growth if it's done, again, authentically and with an eye towards scalability in terms of the different narratives that exist.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, that building those relationships is probably the part that probably I'm guessing a lot of people struggle with, because it feels
Mm-hmm.
very, you know, I don't want to say phony, but like what it feels like. Hey, I'm using you because you're a writer and you have a sort of an audience. Um, but ultimately, they are looking for content. They're thinking
Exactly.
about things, and
100%.
if you're spoon feeding them the content when they're you know, kind of getting writer's block, and it's a slow news, then and you're constantly pinging them, then they have your story kind of in their back pocket. They can always pull it up. I think that's an incredible tip for many people who think, oh, they're going to see right through this. They're not going to care. I can imagine that going through any sort of founder or startup said like, I don't want to waste my time. They don't care.
Mm-hmm.
We don't get any love anyways. But it's kind of like you said, you just gotta strike while the iron's hot, right? There might be a time or a period or a moment where your email or your news kind of comes across their inbox and they need it. So I think that's awesome advice. I definitely don't. I personally don't use that enough. I kind of just move on to the next thing. Um, but yeah, like making sure your PR counterparts, your writers and your newscasters and those people know about it is incredibly important.
Definitely. It's been, again, especially from the context of going 0 to 1, you don't have a
Yeah.
lot of resources, so you got to just figure out ways to make an outsized impact with the resources you do have.
Yeah, no, that's incredible. And you guys again were ahead of your time in terms of. I imagine, Bay, around the COVID time would have done incredible things. Do you ever think about that? Like, oh my gosh, we were a little bit early in Bay.
Honestly, I think we would have crashed out during that COVID time because the people
Yeah,
wouldn't be
maybe.
meeting up. For
Yeah,
that model, I think that was different. But I mean, we would have. I mean, we would have tried to pivot or figure something out, I guess.
yeah. I always wondered like what would have happened if you had kept pushing through with Bay. Um, but anyway,
Sometimes I think about that myself, but I don't know if you would co-sign this, but I think dating space is the
it's
hardest
very it
by
is very
far
tough.
social. 'Cause
100%.
you
I
get
mean,
your stripes, you learn a lot, but I don't think it's necessarily where you want to spend your time. Maybe that's for another. That's
yeah.
probably for another episode. I think we maybe even touched on that before, but
I mean,
yeah,
I would
it's
say
it's
one
it's
and
hard.
two are gaming and dating in terms of difficult, like
Mhm.
hit rates. I would say those two, the balance of that is incredible. Like you are. I mean, especially you're right though. Dating is the hardest because if you do your job right, you lose a
People
customer,
leave.
right? You
It's
lose two
natural,
customers, right?
crazy natural churn, man. Do a good
Right.
job, people leave. You do a bad job, people leave. You can't monetize super easily.
And that balance, like I remember all those meetings were talking about, um, you know,